Hello everybody and welcome to a new video here on my channel. I received a lot of requests to test this camera from you guys and also readers of my website. More requests than usual, I would say, which shows there are people interested in Fujifilm cameras for wildlife and bird photography, even though it may not be the first genre that comes to mind for this particular brand. So let's talk about the X-H2S. The X-H2S is very close to the X-T4 when it comes to the dimensions, especially if you look at the width and height, but it is the substantial grip at the front that makes the S model stand out. It's the kind of grip you want when working with long lenses such as the 100 to 400mm or the new 150 to 600mm. It's solid, large enough to feel good in your hand, and there is enough space to rest your fingers comfortably. I didn't feel the need for an extender or vertical grip. The build quality of the H2S gave me a very positive impression and, as you might expect, it is fully weather sealed. The buttons are a welcome improvement. They're not very big, but they are rounded with enough depth and tactile feedback to be used with precision. I much prefer them to the many flat and small buttons you find on other Fuji cameras. The autofocus joystick is larger, and that is another good step forward in comparison to the tiny version you find elsewhere in the accessories. It is more comfortable and more precise to use. The command dials at the front and rear are easy to grab and turn, however, the one at the rear often has a delay when rotated. Basically, nothing happens when I start to rotate the dial, then the software catches up and I realize I turned too much and I have to go back to the value I wanted. And this happened a lot, especially when using exposure compensation, and it was quite annoying to be fair. I'm not sure if only my sample was affected or if there are other photographers out there experiencing the same with their cameras. Maybe you can let me know in the comments. The camera has 14 function buttons that can be customized with more than 70 options. You can also edit the quick menu and create a My Menu section, so overall the customization is very complete. The ice on the cake is the main dial on top with 7 custom modes, and you can decide to use each one of those custom modes either for stills or video. Very nice. My only criticism is that a few settings are not available for the function buttons, so you have to use the quick menu or the My menu, which are not as fast and straightforward as a button. Among the missing options, there is this subject detection setting. The camera features a very good viewfinder with excellent specs. It is comfortable to work with when wearing glasses, but you lose sight of the 4 extreme corners of the frame. When activating the boost mode, there are several options you can choose. You can give priority to the resolution or lower the frame rate to improve the brightness in low light. Or you can select a fast frame rate for a smoother view when shooting fast action. Interestingly, there is also a 240p option, but Fujifilm specifies that it is an equivalent value. I suspect that in this mode the panel works in interlace mode rather than progressive, doubling the perceived frame rate by merging two fields taken at a slightly different time. Keep in mind that with this mode, the brightness of the viewfinder decreases. The rear monitor is your classic multi-angle LCD. It is touch sensitive and there are various operations you can do with it. On top of the camera, there is a handy LCD that gives you a compelling set of information. It's quite large and you can customize the information it displays separately for still and video, and you can invert the contrast with the small button on DVF. Even when the camera is turned off, the screen shows you how much space is left on the memory card, as well as which card you're recording to and the battery life left. Moving on to the right side of the camera, you'll find two memory card slots. The first takes the larger CF Express Type B card, which is required for certain video formats. The second is compatible with SD UHS-2 cards. On the left, you'll find a full-size HDMI port, microphone input, headphone output, and a USB Type-C port, which works at 10 gigabit per second, and you can use it to charge or power the camera as well. There is also a flash sync port at the front and a 2.5mm remote input above the card compartment. Finally, we have the battery. It is the same used by the X-T4 and offers good performance without being class leading. Something important to understand with Fujifilm cameras is that battery life is largely affected by the boost mode setting I described a few minutes ago. To give you a few examples, my first outing with the camera was 1.5 hour boat trip to photograph seals. I took about 600 images using a low drive speed. I didn't record any video, and the battery lost 60% of its power. Later on in the week, I recorded more than 4,000 images of birds in flight using the fastest continuous shooting speed, and the battery drained again by roughly 60% in the same amount of time, 1.5 hours. So whether I took more or less pictures, it didn't make a difference, but in both cases, the boost mode was active. Now, of course, I could have disabled it for the boat trip, for example, but what you need to know is that the boost mode also increases the autofocus performance. It makes it more reactive, quicker, so I prefer to leave it on. If you do the same, have a couple of spare batteries with you, especially if you will be out all day. I won't spend too much time here because the sensor is very similar to that of the X-T4. It has the X-Trans pixel array, the same resolution, and a back illuminated structure. The main difference is that the H2S sensor is stacked, allowing the camera to have a faster readout speed. It also has a faster image processor, and these two things improve the performance with the electronic shutter, as I'll show you in the next chapter. But the question here is, does the stacked version of this sensor alter the image quality in comparison to the non-stacked sensor? To find out, I put the X-H2S and the X-T4 side by side. My first dynamic range test shows an equal amount of details recovered in the highlights and the same quality in the shadows. Now, the shadow recovery in this example is 2 stops, which doesn't really show you how far you can go with a modern digital sensor. With a more severe exposure recovery of 4 stops, you can see that the H2S produces more noise in comparison to the X-T4. If I zoom further, you can see the loss of details on the neck and blue coat of the stuffed toy for the H2S image. Hopefully, you won't need to recover the exposure that much very often. For the high ISO test, I'm only going to show you a few examples. The results are comparable up to 12800 ISO. Noise on the X-T4 appears slightly thinner and smoother, but it is a small difference. Note that I kept color noise reduction on Lightroom to a minimum of 5. With the extended ISO values, the X-T4 shows more color noise and will require more noise reduction than the H2S. Extended ISO levels are influenced by the image processor and the software, so it's little surprise that the S model does better in comparison to the older X-T4. One last point, you can notice a difference with colors as well. The X-T4 has more green in comparison to the H2S. The X-H2S can shoot up to 15 frames per second with the mechanical shutter and no less than 40 frames per second when selecting the electronic shutter. The improvement over the X-T4 is not only about the increased maximum speed, but also on the fact that the new camera doesn't crop the sensor when using the fastest burst. The H2S can work with live view and no blackouts when shooting with the electronic shutter. Although this is no news, as many Fuji cameras share the same capability, it is nevertheless a nice feature that makes fast and erratic subjects easier to follow. One big advantage of the stacked sensor appears when panning quickly using the electronic shutter. The distortion, aka rolling shutter effect, is less severe. This benefit also applies to video recording. Now, it's fair to say that in general, rolling shutter is not always a concern, provided that the sensor readout of your camera is fast enough. A street lamp, like the one I just showed you, is an easy target to understand the difference, but animals and their more complex body shape make distortion more difficult to detect. I've taken many images of birds in flight with the X-T3 and the X-T4, and I never found this to be a real problem. The H2S has a pre-shot mode where the camera saves a number of images while the shutter button is half pressed. This allows you to catch moments that are difficult to predict. The H2S can save a higher number of frames before the shutter button is fully pressed in comparison to the X-T4, as reported in this table. Finally, we have buffer, aka how long the camera can record at full speed before slowing down the frame rate. First, I tested the three CF Express cards you're seeing right now, and I got the same results when shooting compressed RAW or JPEGs. At 40 frames per second, the camera works for about 4 seconds before slowing down to 15 frames per second with RAW or 16 frames per second with JPEGs. At 30 frames per second, it goes on for approximately 7 seconds before slowing down to 15 frames per second. That is valid with RAW files. With JPEGs, it goes on at full speed for more than 30 seconds. With slower frame rates, the camera never slows down with either file. Note that these results are also valid for lossless compressed RAW, with the only difference being that the speed, once the buffer is full, is slightly slower, around 14 frames per second. What's interesting is that Fujifilm has published on its website a list of official compatible cards. It doesn't mean other cards won't work, it just means these are the ones Fujifilm tested in house. The list also specifies which one of these cards gives you no compromise in performance, and that includes extending the shooting time in burst mode. The two Lexar cards I have here are amongst those no compromise cards, whereas the SanDisk is not. So I was curious to see when this difference would show up, and I found it when shooting uncompressed RAW. With the 2 Lexar, the camera managed to hold for 4 seconds at 40 frames per second, then slow down to 14 frames per second with the diamond card and 11.5 frames per second with the gold card. With the SanDisk, the buffer only lasted for 3 seconds and the speed was much slower afterwards at 7.5 frames per second. Of course, I couldn't test all the cards out there, but hopefully this test can give you an idea of where the differences really lie, at least when it comes to continuous shooting speed. With SD cards, I upgraded some of the old cards I had and I tested the three you're seeing right now. Note that the Angry Bird card is not in the official compatibility list, yet it performs really well. As expected, they didn't match the same performance as the CF Express cards, but they're not too far off. At 40 frames per second, they all do equally well, but with slower speeds, the Angry Bird allowed the camera to maintain a longer buffer in comparison to the other two. The Panasonic card is older and much more used than the other two cards, so unsurprisingly, it came out third in my test. The H2S is yet another mirrorless camera to add subject detection capabilities. It can recognize animals, birds, bikes, cars, planes, and trains. In this video, I'll focus on animals and birds. I first had a chance to test this at a farm in Cardigan. Animal detection works well at first glance, subjects are detected right away, even if they are at a distance. Here is an example where the camera recognized the oyster catcher instantly, despite being quite small in the frame. The camera can identify the body, head, and eyes of a subject and will give priority to one over the other depending on the distance and light condition. For the eye to work correctly, the animal needs to be close enough. If it is too dark or positioned in the shade, the eye might not be detected and the camera will focus on the head instead. If the subject is far, it may switch between head and body depending on the position. Subject detection overrides any autofocus area you have selected as well as its position. You can start detecting an animal within one autofocus area, but then the camera will continue to track head or eyes on the entire frame. In the farm, a few animals like the llama here were not recognized at all, so the camera reverted to the autofocus area selected, which in that case was the 3x3 zone. Focus is not always precise. In more than one occasion, I found the head of the animal to be slightly out of focus, with the camera focusing a bit too far. The second test was during a boat trip around Ramsey Island looking for seals and pups. Here the H2S showed a promising performance. Seals can blend easily with the color and texture of the rocks around them, and to be fair, in a few occasions, it confused the animal with a rock or other natural element nearby, like in this example. But most of the time, the camera was successful in detecting all of them. It also did a good job of tracking the seals when only a small part of their head was above water. It rarely lost sight of them or misfocused completely because of the lack of details or contrast in the scene. Unfortunately, like in the farm earlier on, focus accuracy proved to be a bit challenging at times, with the camera focusing just behind the subject rather than on it. If you have more than one subject in the frame, you cannot jump from one to the other directly, but you can move a small autofocus point near the one you want the autofocus to give priority, as you can see in this simulation here. The problem is that subject detection can be a bit erratic. It can stop detecting one animal and then resumes a few seconds later, even if it hasn't moved and the composition hasn't changed by much. If the animal you gave priority with the autofocus point is not detected anymore, the autofocus will jump to another subject detected in the frame, making the position of your autofocus point irrelevant. In this specific situation, using the wide tracking AF mode instead of other autofocus modes gave me a more stable performance, but it didn't solve the erratic behavior entirely. Actually, on a few occasions, I had to disable subject detection altogether and move a single autofocus point manually on the seal I wanted to focus on. Another point is that animals and birds are two separate settings. The boat trick gave me the opportunity to photograph seabirds as well as seals, and I had to manually change the type of subject to track each time. To be honest, you don't need to change the setting all the time. I took a shot of a distant oyster catcher with the animal setting on, and the camera simply reverted back to my 3x3 zone and focused successfully. It won't always be a problem, but it would be easier to have one setting for all types of animals. The wrong setting might still work occasionally. The seal in this picture was taken with bird detection rather than animal detection, but the camera misinterpreted the seal head popping out of the water for a bird. Most of the time, however, bird detection will only work with birds and vice versa. The third test was with small birds perched on a tree, a regular scene I try to photograph with each camera I review. Like many other cameras with the same functionality, bird detection becomes very useful when you have branches or other elements that can interfere with your subject. The H2S successfully focused on the eye of a robin half hidden behind a small log, as well as various birds surrounded by autofocus leaves in the foreground. The camera did well with subjects in the shades too. Here as well, focus can lack precision, and the bird can be slightly out of focus because the distance is either a bit too short or a bit too long. A busy background and distracting elements can also confuse the software, with the subject detection rectangle on screen focusing on something else rather than the animal itself. Nevertheless, this is where bird detection autofocus remains a valuable ally. You can see in the photo here how the camera kept the head and eye sharp while the larger body is slightly soft. As always, I went to my two favorite red kite fitting stations to test the camera with the new 150 to 600mm as well as the older 100 to 400mm that I've used many times. You can read more about my birds in flight test on my website. As usual, you'll find the link in the description. I can tell you right from the start that the X-H2S doesn't bring a substantial improvement over the X-T4. Here is the best score I got with the camera and how it compares with other Fujifilm models. Let's break down these results. First of all, the best score is valid whether you shoot at 20 frames per second or 40 frames per second, which is a positive thing. The substantial difference in keeper rate depends on the background. With a plain background, blue or cloudy sky, the H2S does well in terms of keeper rate. But as soon as the birds fly in front of trees, fields, or you name it, the performance is inferior. The main problem with a busy background is that the camera gets confused on what to follow and often loses the kite in favor of trees, fields, or other natural elements. It happened many times with different settings and in the two different locations. Often the camera will start with the bird in focus and then lose it in the middle of the sequence. Other times, it started with the bird already out of focus and it didn't always manage to correct focus quickly. I was hoping bird detection would improve the performance since it is one of the major new features of the camera, but it actually made things worse. The best results I got were all with this setting turned off. Note that if you're only photographing birds in the sky, you can try to use bird detection with the wide tracking mode. It doesn't do as much damage as with a busy background, but it doesn't make a substantial difference either. It really is a shame because in the nearly 10,000 photos I captured, I got many that I really like, and I also have a few nearly perfect long sequences where the camera followed the bird from start to finish with little trouble. But the performance is unpredictable. You can get a great sequence, then in the next one it misfocuses after a few frames. The other problem with the H2S, just like previous Fuji cameras, is the number of slightly soft results. The camera struggles to keep optimal sharpness on every frame, and that happened with both lenses. I tried all sorts of setting combinations. I even decided to start from scratch, thinking that perhaps bird detection needed a fresh approach in finding the optimal settings in comparison to my previous experience with Fuji cameras. But unfortunately, I couldn't find the magic combination, and to be honest, I don't think there is one. Here is how the Fuji compares to other mirrorless cameras. Now, some of you will say that the H2S may have a lower autofocus score, but it takes more images per second than, say, the S7 IV. 40 versus 10 frames per second is a big difference, and it's a fair comment, but it doesn't tell you the whole story, in my opinion. My birds in flight score gives you an idea of how good the autofocus is, how precise it is, and ultimately how much you can rely on it. Now, the A7 IV may do only 10 frames per second, but I can trust its autofocus at all times. It rarely misfocuses on the background, it rarely gives me slightly soft results or images where the focus point is a bit too short or a bit too far in comparison to the subject, and it's always consistent and it has less settings to worry about. Now, sure, 40 frames per second can be very handy in specific scenarios, especially when combined with the pre-shot mode, which is something the S7 IV doesn't have, for example, but otherwise, I would not hesitate to pick the Sony over the Fuji if autofocus performance is what I care the most about. I'll finish off with a list of recommended settings for birds in flight when using the X-H2S. The X-H2S offers a substantial upgrade in the video department, packing a set of features that you won't find on a lot of mirrorless cameras, including more expensive models. This is certainly the biggest difference with previous Fuji APS-C products. Here is a summary of what you can do with this camera and how it compares to the X-T4. Keep in mind that you need a CF Express card to record ProRes, and you can refer to the official compatibility list to see which one is recommended. You'll find the link in the description. For this video, I'll just share some useful information related to wildlife and birds. First, the 6.2K resolution can be very useful when inserted in a 4K timeline on your editing software because you can zoom in on your footage while retaining excellent details and image quality. The option of recording 4K 120p is useful to appreciate animals in slow motion. The sensor crop might not be welcomed by everybody, but for wildlife it can allow you to get closer to the animal, so it's not so bad. In Full HD, you can record up to 240 frames per second with a more severe crop. However, the quality is worse even in comparison to the normal Full HD mode. Subject detection works during video recording, but here as well the results are inconsistent. There are moments where the performance is decent, when the background is not too busy, like in these examples you're watching right now. It doesn't always maintain the subject razor sharp, but it doesn't lose it completely. With busy backgrounds, it can hesitate more, going back and forth more frequently between the background and the subject. When the bird is flying, the camera struggles even more. The stabilization can be very effective with static shots, especially if you add a digital IS. I recorded with the new 150 to 600mm and the results are very usable even at 600mm. With such long focal length, the optical stabilization of the lens certainly does more than IBIS on the camera, but it shows how good this combo can be. Be careful with your settings when doing camera movements. This is what happens when you forget to disable the IS boost mode, for example, which is designed to work with static shots only and no panning. The camera seems to do well with overheating too. I recorded 1 hour and 50 minutes in 4K 50p before the battery died. The overheat symbol appeared after 1 hour and 10 minutes, but the camera never stopped. You can also push the limits by setting auto power off temperature to high, and there is the option to attach a cooling fan to the back of the camera. While I was preparing this video, Fujifilm released Firmware 2.0 for the H2S. Now unfortunately my sample was already back with the rental company by that time, which is unfortunate. In the notes enclosed with the update, the company states the following. The bug has been fixed, which caused that the focal point of a lens was sometimes behind the subject when shooting the small object by selecting subject detection setting. From what I can understand from this not so great description, they may have fixed the issue where the focus point goes right behind your subject rather than on it, as I showed you earlier on in this video. Now, whether this also influences my birds in flight test remains to be seen, but I somehow doubt it because I had problems with the camera focusing on the background even when subject detection was turned off. Now, I'm pretty sure Fujifilm will release other firmware updates in the future. Perhaps one of these updates will focus on improving the whole autofocus performance. It wouldn't be the first time. So I will try to test the camera again in the future, but it's a bit difficult for me to run the camera every time there is a new firmware update, also because I want to test other products. But I will try to do my best. Right, time to conclude the video, and I won't hide it from you, I was expecting more from the X-H2S. On paper, this camera is the most advanced APC model on the market, alongside the X-H2. At the time of publishing this video, of course, it packs a lot of interesting specs and promises top-notch performance, but the reality, once I viewed all the images on my hard drive, tells a different story, also considering the high price. My main disappointment has to do with the autofocus. The improvements are smaller than expected. The results for birds in flight are no better than those of the X-T4, and even the XS10 is on the same level. Sure, the subject detection mode is a great addition for static shots, but I'm not sure it's worth spending the money just for that, also considering that it is not 100% reliable and can even make things worse for fast-moving animals. The stacked sensor and faster image processor increased the maximum dry speed, got rid of the sensor crop, and minimized the rolling shutter effect when using the electronic shutter. Buffer is also much better, and don't get me wrong, these are all welcome improvements, but I wouldn't consider them game-changing either. They feel like a natural evolution you come to expect in such a high-end product in 2022. I don't want to sound overly negative. The H2S has other strengths like excellent ergonomics, a big amount of customization, a great viewfinder, and impressive performance for video. Perhaps the latter is what makes this camera stand out more than anything else. But going back to the main subject of this video, which is wildlife and bird photography, I can only say the X-H2S is not the killer APC camera we were perhaps waiting for. And if the ergonomics, the viewfinder, the subject detection mode are enough for you to upgrade, then I wonder if the cheaper X-H2 could be a better deal. Also considering that you get a brand new 40 megapixel sensor. Now I'll try to test that one later on, so stay tuned. And I guess that's it for this video then. Thank you very much for watching. Please like and subscribe. Don't hesitate to leave a comment if you have any question, as usual, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.